This week, Ducati announced a brand new long-distance off-road bias version of their Multistrada V4 adventure bike called the Rally. And it's a format that's already proven to work, firstly by the mega popular BMW R1250 GS Adventure, and then more recently the Triumph Tiger 1200 Rally Explorer, a bike that I really enjoyed when I had it on loan this summer. But the Ducati now matches most of their specs and even exceeds them in some areas. So is it now the perfect adventure bike? Well, in this video, we'll go over all of the details to find out. But before we get started, I just want to say a massive thanks to Alpaca for sponsoring this video. They make a range of super stylish sling bags and backpacks that are perfect for carrying your essentials on the bike. I've been using their Bravo Sling Mini for carrying stuff like my phone, wallet and keys. Or if I'm working, I use their Elements backpack for taking a laptop and all the associated peripherals. I'm super impressed by the quality and the cool design, and they're really well thought out with loads of internal pockets and straps and neat features like the magnetic connectors that make it super easy to get the bag on and off even when you're wearing motorcycle gloves. I'd thoroughly recommend checking them out, and they've also been kind enough to give me a 15% discount code for my viewers, which you'll find down in the description below, along with a link to their website. So once again, a massive thanks to Alpaca for their support. Now the big one on this new Rally model is the 30-litre fuel tank, and you could say that this bike really needed it. The V4 Gran Turismo engine is pretty impressive in terms of performance figures with 170 horsepower on tap. That's more power than any other adventure bike on the market, but it is a thirsty beast, and so the standard bike could drink through the 20-litre tank in no time. I definitely found this when I reviewed one. It was an incredible bike to ride, but I was stopping and looking to fill up a lot more frequently than I'd probably like, especially for a bike that's meant to be designed for long distances and touring. 30 litres puts it bang in line with the GS Adventure, and that's one of the best-selling bikes in the UK alongside with the regular GS, and surely for the adventure model that big tank is a massive selling point. Triumph have been paying attention with their new Tiger 1200, and you can get either the road bias GT model or the off-road bias Rally in the Explorer trim with the 30-litre tank amongst other features. So on first impressions, it sounds like good news for the Multi V4 to be at the big tank party, but unfortunately it's still going to be at a bit of a disadvantage because that new big tank can't quite compensate for its drinking habit. You see, the GS sips on fuel at 4.75 litres per 100 kilometers traveled, and part of that is probably the shift cam tech in the Boxer twin engine that means it runs on a less aggressive cam profile when you're just cruising along, and it only switches over to the sporty cam when you need the extra power. The Tiger isn't bad on fuel either at 5.1 litres per 100 kilometers, and so those two bikes are pretty much neck and neck, but the Multi uses a whopping 6.5 litres per 100 kilometers, and so the range is significantly less than the other bikes, like 100 miles less than the GS. So I guess all this depends on where you're coming from. If you've got a regular Multi V4 and the range is a bit annoying, or that was one of the factors stopping you from buying one, then the Rally is certainly worth a look. And you know, 300 miles of range is still pretty damn good. But if you just want the longest distance adventure bike on the market, then unfortunately this is not it. That said, I had to make some assumptions on the last point because the Multi V4 Rally does get an interesting new feature, and that's the extended version of their rear cylinder deactivation. The original idea was that the two rear cylinders stop firing when the bike's at a standstill, because with the V4 engine, those two are right under the rider's backside, and so when there's no wind chill to cool you down, it does get a little toasty. The front two cylinders keep the engine spinning, and then as soon as you want to move off, the rear two cylinders kick back in seamlessly without you even noticing. Now with this new Rally model, the same thing can happen, but while you're actually on the move. So they say that in order to improve emissions and consumption, the rear two cylinders can remain off in certain riding conditions, like at low speeds, and so effectively you're like riding along on a 600cc parallel twin with those front two cylinders. So perhaps fuel consumption, at least around town and that sort of riding, is a little bit better, and then maybe my range figures from earlier were a touch pessimistic, because you see I had to use the consumption figure from the standard Multi V4 without this this feature. And that's because there's no consumption figure for the Rally model on the spec sheet yet. Sometimes this does happen because they've not finished the testing properly of the bike before they put the press release out, or you might speculate that maybe the improvements aren't actually that great, so they intentionally left it off. Who knows? But they do say this bike takes the Globetrotter spirit to a higher level, and with that they've sought to improve comfort in the saddle, especially for 2-up riding. So there's a new bigger windscreen that's 40mm taller and 20mm wider. The tail has been lengthened and the luggage mounts have been moved further back to give you a little more leg room. And also you get big rubber footrest inserts for both the rider and the passenger to keep the vibes in your feet to a minimum. Plus you've got that semi-active Showa Skyhook suspension, which should keep things nice and cushy. And there's the front and rear radar for adaptive cruise control and blind spot warnings, and so it should make for a pretty awesome motorway bike. Now the radar tech will almost certainly come to the GS at some point soon because BMW have used it on some of their other bikes, but at the moment you can't get it, and the Tiger 1200 only has the rear radar for blind spot warnings, no active cruise control. So you could say that in that field, at the moment, the Ducati has them both beat. Now this Globetrotter spirit that they've mentioned could also lead you down a few dusty old trails, and so they've made a couple of tweaks to improve off-road performance as well. Firstly, there's a new Enduro riding mode, and that limits peak power to 114 horses, so that should be easier to get on with on low grip surfaces. And then on top of that, it gives you less traction control intervention and switches off the wheelie control so that you can keep momentum whilst climbing up gravelly hills. Plus, the suspension firms up with a dedicated off-road setting, and the ABS on the rear wheel plus the cornering function and the rear wheel lift detection all deactivate. On top of that, you've now got 200mm of travel in the suspension front and rear, and so that's quite a bit up on the 170 and 180 of the regular Multi V4, although it's not quite up there with the GS at 210 and 220, or the Tiger, which gets 220 front and rear. Plus, the Tiger is the only one out of the bunch that gets a proper 21-inch front wheel, so that should give it better rolling off-road, and it gets an 18-inch rear, whereas the BMW and the Ducati get a more road-biased 19 front and 17 rear. It depends what you like to do really, and whether you're actually going to take your massive adventure bike off-road that much. And they are all pretty massive, so the Ducati's 260 kilograms curb, the Tiger a touch more at 261, and the GS is the heaviest of the bunch at 268, although granted, it does hold that weight pretty low with the Boxer twin engine. Now there are a few other tweaks here and there on this bike, but the one that jumped out at me on the spec sheet most was this new easy lift function, which will definitely be handy on a tall 260 kilogram bike with a 30-litre fuel tank. You see, it already has this minimum preload function, which they added to the Multi V4S last year, and that does something similar to Harley's adaptive ride height. So when you slow down to a stop, the preload backs off and that lowers the bike down and makes it super easy to touch the floor. But Easy Lift, according to Ducati, opens the suspension hydraulics at key on, reducing the effort required to lift the motorcycle from the side stand thanks to the fork and shock absorber compression. Very clever stuff, I like it a lot, and it's these little touches that make these bikes feel worth the asking price. Speaking of, you're looking at £23,590 for the Multi V4 Rally, which is really quite eye-watering. The most expensive Tiger 1200 with all the goodies is $19,100, and the GSA claims to start at $15,650, but by the time you add all the comparable features, it ends up costing about the same as the Tiger, but still, that's a massive amount, about $4,000 on top for the Multistrada. So is it the perfect adventure bike? Well, maybe not given that price, and also the fuel consumption is still pretty aggressive. You do get the radars though for the money, and also that nice new little suspension feature, but the price point is probably going to be a bit of a deal breaker for a lot of people, especially with the GS being such a proven performer. As always though, I'd love to know which bike you'd pick down in the comments below, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.